Just before Christmas, a kind friend gave me a pair of socks, inscribed in German, "Here I stand, I can do no other. Hier stehe ich kann nicht anders." Well, I thought that was very funny, and I put the socks on as soon as I could, and I'm wearing them now. But you'd need to get the historical reference before you laughed. It's what Martin Luther is said to have said, in German, to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, at a very early stage of the Protestant Reformation. And nobody was laughing then. Luther's words were a cry of defiance against all the powers in church and state who stood in the way of what he was convinced was truth. His pursuit of truth tore a continent in two, and then in three, and then more. This year, 2017, is the 500th anniversary of an event now so mythic that some have doubted that it ever took place. If it did, the date was 31st of October 1517, and the main actor was Luther, a friar who was also a university lecturer, and then hardly known outside his religious order or his university, for he'd published virtually nothing. He nailed an announcement of discussion points in a proposed university seminar to a church door in a muddy three-street town on the North German plain called Wittenberg. And the subject now seems totally obscure. Luther condemned indulgences, which were scraps of parchment or paper issued by the church and promising the purchaser of them time off purgatory. But the pinball machine of history sent the consequences flying round a continent, and we're still watching the ricochets. Luther's seminar never took place, but within half a century, participant observers from Truro to Transylvania were calling the unintended consequences the Reformation. Those not much acquainted with the 16th century, or with what European Christians worry about, may be wondering what caused all the fuss. It's all the more puzzling because when you look at the traditional church of the time, it was not in terrible decay. It had its problems, well, churches always do, but overall it satisfied the emotional needs of the vast majority of people. It was powerful, well-funded, and apparently successful in satisfying consumer demand. That's what makes the Reformation so interesting. It wasn't caused by social and economic changes or even by a secular idea like nationalism. It sprang from a big idea about death, salvation, and the afterlife. When your default assumption was that God existed, what happened to you after death was a prime concern. In 16th century Europe, it would take a real effort of imagination to disbelieve in God, really the reverse of how things are in the modern West. Now, if that was so, you were likely to be concerned about God's plans for when you died. Was it going to be eternal joy or eternal torment? Luther's revolutionary message actually just restated a basic belief from the Christian package of ideas, that God was all-powerful, and therefore he was the Lord of death as well as of life. Nothing that human beings can do would alter his decision about our fate, only his own mercy and judgment. Now, that thought made a nonsense of the intricate structure of intercessory prayer for the dead, which the late medieval Western Church had created to help people towards heaven. Masses, chantries, indulgences. The whole point of all that frantic activity was to do some business with God, influence the future. Luther's discovery didn't spring out of his own head, for it was there in the earliest Christian writings, the letters of the Apostle Paul. And it was then restated at great length 4 centuries after Paul by the greatest thinker that Western Latin Christianity has produced, the North African bishop Augustine. Augustine concentrated on Paul's idea of God's unchallengeable power as if he were training the rays of the sun through a magnifying glass until fire burst out beneath. He contrasted an all-powerful God with human beings utterly fallen, utterly corrupt, because the first humans had been disobedient to God's will. Augustine called a human being a lump of perdition, a lump of lostness. There's nothing that lumps of lostness, which is people like you and me and Augustine, can do for our own salvation. We need God to do it all. This old and new thought about death seized Martin Luther when he read Augustine. So, in 1517, he announced that seminar condemning the Church's teaching on indulgences. In the clergy's understandable, even admirable concern to ease people's fears of death, they'd offered folk these indulgences, even offered them for sale. Since Luther was attacking the Church's claim to help people in gaining their salvation, his stand became a power struggle in a much wider sense. So, the Reformation was based on a profound pessimism about human beings. For that reason, the Reformation had a difficult relationship with the other great movement of thought in the 15th and 16th centuries, what we now call the Renaissance. The Renaissance discovered new potential in human beings. Its scholars and writers were called humanists. Renaissance humanists were overwhelmingly Christians, but they wanted to emphasize that human beings have value. Someone like the great humanist Erasmus of Rotterdam would certainly not have taken the view that human beings were a lump of lostness. That meant that Protestant reformers who were also humanists had to do some hard thinking. Take the pioneer reformer of the Swiss city of Zurich, Ulrich Zwingli, who rolled out a Reformation in Zurich at the same time as Luther did in Wittenberg. Now, Zwingli was a humanist, but that didn't stop him becoming a Protestant. Zwingli's fascinating because he believed that Christianity is about here and now, that it's concerned to improve contemporary society. He found the writings of Erasmus inspiring, but like Luther, he was still also Augustine's man, and so he was torn between humanism and the Reformation. The Swiss Reformation was constantly puzzling its way through that paradox. It was a movement of social reform far more than Luther's Reformation, and generally it had a broader appeal beyond the governing classes who embraced and sustained Lutheranism in Northern Europe. And these two Protestant movements have remained divided since the very first days of the Reformation. Luther, who'd contradicted the Pope so much, never took kindly to being contradicted himself. His followers melded into an identity called Lutheran. But what about the other Protestants all over Europe who didn't? Often in modern times they've been called Calvinist, but that's not a good label because it singles out John Calvin, only one of their leaders among many. They could hardly just call themselves not Lutherans, so they took a label which was a wonderful piece of one-upmanship. They were Reformed Protestants with a capital R. Amid all these complications, it was not the religiously indifferent who became Protestants, but rather those who, like Luther, had believed passionately in the old Western Church's road to salvation, and who are now convinced that they'd been cheated. White-hot Catholics became white-hot Protestants. Hence their deep bitterness against the old structure, and hence also the bitterness of those who fought back to defend it. In the 16th century, Europeans burned one another for denying that bread could become God, or that Jesus was fully God, or fully God and fully human. They hanged people for not believing in government by bishops. In the past, they did things very differently. Or did they? The modern world has watched in horror while similar things happen right now. Not here in Europe, but in the Middle East. ISIS, ISIL or Daesh have done bestial things to people and destroyed holy places in the name of religion, just like Reformation Christians. I've heard people blame Islam for what these criminals have done, but just remember the Reformation. Christianity's record in history is no better. That's not to excuse any atrocity now, merely to see that human stupidity and wickedness can colonise any religion or any belief. It's a lesson from history. And actually, history teaches a cheerful lesson too. Not all Reformation-era Christians so badly misread the message of their religion. It was mostly Western Europeans, especially the supposedly tolerant English, who killed each other in the 16th century Reformation. Elsewhere, there were wide areas of toleration in Europe, which we've forgotten about because they were far away in Eastern Europe, in Poland, Hungary, and the mountain principality of Transylvania. It's sad that we remember the former Transylvania for Count Dracula, who never existed, rather than as the first Christian country officially to declare that everyone ought to be able to worship God in their own way, without interference. The Transylvanian Parliament, or Diet, spelled this out as early as 1568 in a declaration made in the parish church of a little town called Torda. They said, "Ministers should everywhere preach and proclaim the gospel according to their understanding of it. And if their community is willing to accept this, good. If not, however, no one should be compelled by force if their spirit is not at peace. No one is allowed to threaten to imprison or banish anyone because of their teaching, because faith is a gift from God." Now that sounds more like Christianity as I think it should be. Gradually, the rest of Europe caught up with this dangerous idea that you shouldn't oppress those who think differently. It took a century, climaxing in a particularly horrible 30 Years' War, to make European Christians sick of killing each other. And the Reformation folded into the Enlightenment, which was not so much a rejection of religion as a different way of doing religion. The Reformation had been an argument about how to read Christianity's sacred text, the Bible. In the Enlightenment, even religious people started reading sacred texts with a critical eye, placing them beside other texts, understanding better the historical circumstances in which they were written. In other words, standing back a bit from them. The effect has been to split modern Western Christianity down the middle, between those who embrace and those who reject the Enlightenment. This great divide now makes most arguments of the Reformation seem irrelevant. It places religious conservatives on the same side in a culture war. I mean, conservative Catholics and conservative Protestants. And on the other side, you have liberal Catholics and liberal Protestants, and those beyond Christianity. In recent decades, this war has been about sex, but we might choose to change the battleground. The overarching issue is authority. Do we arrive at truths by individual judgment, thinking things out for ourselves, or, as religious conservatives of all stripes maintain, by respecting authoritative church leaders or an infallible sacred text? What would Luther think? I hope that if he were alive now and saw what we've seen, he would say again, "Here I stand, I can do no other." You make your mind up using the brains God has given you. And I'd be happy to stand beside him in my Reformation socks. Tomorrow, I'll go to the heart of one big issue in Reformation quarrels: Mary, the Mother of God.